Welcome to Exploration Session Summaries. Exploration sessions are offered online as opportunities to speak and listen to each other in a sincere effort to gain understanding about each other's perspectives on a World Conference resolution. A single resolution is the focus of 5 sessions each week. At the conclusion of each session, the breakout groups share a summary of their conversations. This podcast includes all small groups' summaries on one resolution. For more information about exploration sessions, go to seaofchrist.org/2023-world-conference.
Okay, for question 1, life experiences that informed your perspective, there was a person of color and having experienced some of the impacts of discrimination as a child as well as an adult, with lack of access to public facilities, educational resources, indignities of exclusion. This resolution speaks to the great need to address that, and also the desire for the church to be truly on the forefront of fighting racism. Other members of the group talked about the fact that they could not step in the shoes, be a person of color, know what that truly means from observations of what's going on in the news, from reading things like 1619. It has allowed them to have a broader perspective. Others talked about exposure to the Black community through their family life experiences and the impact of things like the I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington, and use of films like Eyes on the Prize. They have broadened their perspective and also helped others to have a greater understanding. There was a member who questioned and still has some undecidedness about whether the resolution is needed because we do have things like the enduring principles that stress the worth of all persons. For question number 2, the benefits included being able to highlight racism as a sin, as a faith community would be a bold statement that the resolution informs the membership and those outside of the church that this faith community believes it is important to call it out, and that this declaration would allow individual members or encourage individual members and the institution to look at itself and actually take action, particularly in the third resolve. Other members, again, expressed concern that it may not be necessary because of other statements we have in the church. One member suggested that this could have a particularly powerful impact on people of European heritage to have this resolve, especially if we also have a good PR person who lets everyone know within the church and outside the church that this is our stance. The other members talked about the real challenge being in operationally making this a fact, that we can state and have stated many positive things. For example, legislation that was supported of the LGBTQ plus community being a part of the priesthood, and how long it took, over a decade, between a resolution that supported that and any particular action being taken. So the notion of using listening circles as a device to help people come to greater understanding, change not only their minds, but activate the spirit to work within each individual. So the hardest part is relearning what we've been taught, and listening circles might be a very useful tool in that. Educating people that race is a social construct and not a biological fact is one of the things that may be helpful in this discussion. The concern is that pastors and mission center presidents are supportive and will take action if this is passed to encourage membership and support membership efforts. one of the things that we noted is that while there is some indecisiveness on the part of one member of our discussion group about the necessity of it, if it is approved, if the resolution is approved, the hardest part or the most challenging part will be to actually make actions fit the words.
Most of the people in our group grew up with little exposure to people of color, but we did have experiences as we got older, some through classes, also meeting people and becoming friends with people. The last few years have been eye-opening as far as beginning to notice racism in ourselves. One person in our group has an African-American son-in-law, and that has been a different experience too, that changes her perspective on things. One person lived outside of Chicago in the late 60s and early 70s, and because of all the riots was very fearful. And then we had a person who grew up around Black people and saw discrimination firsthand, such as Blacks having to go to the back of the bus and a Black member of their sports team not being able to stay at the same hotel as the rest of the team. That was our life experiences. And then what effect it might have, help people to become more open to learning and more open to people of color, help us to do self-examination, encourage us in justice making, and helping us to own our own history, naming the problem. And then one person felt like the resolution kind of almost doesn't go far enough. What can we really do to make change? And then another person in the group gave examples of how we can become involved. Another effect it could have that would be very beneficial is it can help church leaders be able to do more on a local level without having to get approval. One of the challenges is figuring out how to get involved and having conversations with people. There's no single answer for everyone, and specifics could be limiting because if it's going to be different in different areas. How will people of color respond to this action? Another challenge is difficulty in getting a congregation together to get involved. And this is more aimed at, quote, white countries. It'll be more of a challenge for some areas. And some places are already doing things that they're already involved. And World Conference delegates are predominantly white. How do we make sure we hear other perspectives?
Our group talked a lot about experiences going to church with people from other cultures and races and being able to learn about their experiences. Another group member talked about traveling as well as at college, where they were the minority when they usually are not. Two people also mentioned their experiences as teachers and watching children of different races interact. They also talked about teaching Native history, and one member talked about the complexity of teaching that history to Native children as a white teacher. Another member shared about their experience with a protest for racial justice that was happening near their home and seeing hostile counter-protesters and police violence toward protesters. We also talked a lot about living in primarily white communities and learning about our unconscious and conscious biases. We talked about questions of how we can implement this resolution into our congregation, because many of us attend congregations and are living in communities that don't have a lot of diversity. From this question, we talked about how education is going to be important in doing this. Ideas such as a book club, maybe an online book club where we could learn about others' experiences was also brought up. We also talked about how we could learn to listen to others' experiences from people of different cultures without trying to fix the issue, but just to feel the pain with them. Challenges, just the importance of being able to implement the resolution. And since we live in these very non-diverse areas, how can we affect any kind of change? We talked about how anything worth doing has its challenges. And even though we are a small church, There's a lot of hope in the fact that we all want to make a difference. One member talked about how environmental issues are related directly to racial justice. We talked about the insights we had gained from hearing one another's experiences, and also that we would be interested in hearing the experiences and perspectives of people from other countries, since the history is different.
Our group has witnessed open prejudice that directly impacted an activity that we were in. We've been in situations in which we were the minority, so we could observe a little bit about what that was like, but also, even though we were the minority, some awareness that we still had privilege in that situation. Over time, we did recognize that as we were growing up, that people of color were treated differently. We studied history and the impact of that history on our country, explored our own feelings when we were working with people that weren't like us. And then some of us have lived through the societal effects, racist thinking like segregation in schools and segregated pools. And then some of us put ourselves into or, joined organizations that help, like the Youth Corps or Camp Counselor, Peace and Justice groups, and Peace Corps. Now, the impact versus benefit, or impact and benefit, is an awareness that we all have racist thoughts, even if we're not doing those, just in the way we think about each other in an us versus them manner. The benefit is a global benefit that shows everybody where our church stands, and that we're part of that group that stand this way. But the impact is personal, because, well, now they're calling it out for what it is. It's a sin, and we're all engaging in that, and that is impacting and convicting. That this resolution has teeth in it, that it lays out what we need to do. There's several action items on it, that it might put us in a position of calling out, and has already put people from our group in a position to call out our congregations, that we see what the media is telling us is what is happening, and where we are lacking. And so that gives us kind of a to-do list, and it points our church towards a public statement towards inclusion. The challenges and insights, changing the ideas of others is very hard. Overcoming mindset is very hard. That sometimes laying down rules and laws can, not only create like an attitude of opposition to begin with, but also cause maybe reverse discrimination, like that there's always going to be one group of people that are not given equal access. Helping people of color, also standing beside them and encouraging them to gain confidence, and just giving them more, adding a chord to the group. Maybe that's a better way to group, all of us standing together. We need to be prayerful and make sure that we see Christ in everybody, and then beware of being complacent like the world. We're used to the status quo, but we are people of God, and so we shouldn't be complacent. Try to think in particular rather than as a group. How does this impact the person standing in front of you? Have compassion for people who aren't getting access to things that we get access, or having things be as easy. Also, take a look at the kids don't start being racist. They're learning not to be. We need to be careful that we're not laying ideas into their head. Watch them, but also a recognition that we need to keep trying and trying and trying. It still might take generations, but don't stop trying, and call attention to the right actions.
We found that personal experiences were the most powerful change agents, causing us growing experience and change in our perspectives. So that in that first question, there was a lot of sharing about different personal experiences, whether they were kind of through life or even into adulthood, and how those actually changed people's perspective and toward a positive. There was one concern that came up with the group, the fact that there's an emphasis in the resolution on what appears to be U.S. History, that racism has been around for a whole lot longer than 400 years. It's a very, very ancient construct, and that we need to be aware of that, and maybe we need to kind of generalize it a little bit more. So that's the first question. The second, and that came up a couple of times as a concern. Also, do we need this? Is it repetitious? And then this reminds us that we have much to learn, much to do in finding active, engaged pathways to taking steps to make this, the aspects of this resolution happen. So in our personal lives, in our congregational lives, and ways to step out. And that was about living out the worth of all persons, living out our enduring principles. And then the third has to do with the challenge. How do we live it? Primarily, how do we live it? That some people really don't see it as a problem. We have a very diverse, different perspectives on white privilege within the world and within the church, and to be cognizant of that. But I think that we also realize that individually we can only do what we can make choices to do, and to actively support others in those similar kinds of choices.
One of the things we noted is that within our group, all of us were Caucasian, but interestingly, many or all of us lived or worked in or made deep friendships and family connections in diverse settings. So we actually had lived experience among a variety of people of color. We talked about the fact that we all, though, do come with a US lens, and that we think that the group here tonight is all coming with a US perspective, and that may slant the reaction somewhat to the resolution itself. The other comment that was made is that the people that are here tonight are likely those who are more comfortable discussing racism or historical structural racism within their own nation or the world, and that perhaps some self-sorting has happened so that those who are opposed to the resolution, and several have come up and identified themselves in other settings, are not ready to discuss it. And so we may not be seeing them here. They're self-sorting out. There was agreement in the group that the United States in particular, the nation we know, has structural historical racism. There was a desire for the church to recommend existing resources, not that they create new ones, but existing resources that would help us self-reflect on racism. We also commented that the idea for many in the church to self-reflect on one's own racism is very, very difficult. And for many in our polarized society, there would not be a willingness to do so. That would feel like an attack. We commented on the fact that within the United States, we do not have a large number of people of color, and it would be helpful to have their perspective. But we did acknowledge, as we talked about it, that the worldwide church is becoming more and more people of color. And we are interested in knowing what would be those delegates' response to this resolution and what would be the lens with which they see it. Then the other comment that was made is that because within the United States and North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, because so many of those members are predominantly white, it is very, very difficult for people of color who are members to come forward and express an opinion or share their own life experience because they feel that they would be subjected to being attacked, and so they may not be willing to come forward. And then the final thing was a question. what is the intended outcome if this resolution passed?
First and foremost, there was an expression of appreciation for the resolution just opening the dialogue within the church. We think that that's a wonderful thing. And it was brought up specifically that the potential for this being very significant for those individuals who have been negatively impacted by racial injustice, either within the church or within the world. For those individuals, having the church come out and say, we see you, we recognize that there's a problem, and we're willing to work towards alleviating that problem, that's a wonderful thing. That's the good part. The maybe more difficult part is in discussing the challenges of the resolution itself. The consensus really was that there is not enough specificity regarding the action items of this resolution. The idea that perhaps this is one of those resolutions that maybe it gets passed and then nothing ever happens, it's a little disappointing in that way. So, to maybe attach some more action items to it as far as amendments from the floor. And the point was brought up that we have some really wonderful teams within the World Church that could be getting involved in the action item aspect of this resolution. For example, the diversity and inclusion team, the peace and justice team, human rights team, the ecumenical and interfaith team, all could be tasked by the First Presidency to take the next year or two and come up with some action items of their own, perhaps some curriculum that the church could be following in order to better educate ourselves in this issue and to learn how to fight it in a productive manner. It was also brought out that it's important to look at a lot of different perspectives. And frankly, as Kathy was talking, I recognized that our group too was all Caucasian and all North American. And perhaps we need to get more of a world view on what this is, because racism within the United States doesn't necessarily look the same as racism within even Canada, let alone Africa or South America. So broadening this out to be a little more inclusive in a worldview, I think would be a very good thing.
We all realized that we had all had childhood experiences that had informed our perspectives on these issues. And sometimes we had some really negative experiences and sometimes some really positive ones. And of course, had a diversity of experience as we have all grown up and reached adulthood. But we did realize that our youth need to be talking about this issue. And sometimes you need to point out when you see things like institutional racism or other acts of racism so that they can address it and identify it in their childhood and in their adulthood as they grow up. And like the other groups, we also felt that we really needed a diversity of people within the listening session, within our own congregations. I mean, just broader and broader. And I think many times we kept coming back to this idea that we felt like the resolution seemed maybe a little bit too Americanized or written through from a white perspective, perhaps. I don't know if that is true. The group also identified some things that were helpful, even if it's a resolution that doesn't really dictate, that a team has to go off and create some resources or something. It can be useful to have a resolution to refer to or back you up if you're, for example, preaching a sermon and somebody says, you shouldn't say that from the pulpit. You can say, yeah, well, the World Church says. We had a lot of questions about the who, what, why, et cetera, of why it was written, who wrote it. And we want that diversity of viewpoints. Perhaps our worship styles can change if we have a more diverse group. We wondered if the resolves were really strong enough. They seemed sort of fluffy. we wondered if there were any, if the resolution might create a situation that might pose harm to other cultures, or even that certain people might feel like this resolution is an attack on them.
We had people in our group who both had experienced prejudice and also who came to the understanding of their innate prejudice and privilege late in life. We feel it will impact the church because it will keep in front of us in the forefront this issue, help us think about it. And although it's broad and there are no specifics about what they want it to happen, it will help educate and bring awareness of the importance of systemic racism. Faith can either reinforce who we already are and what we're doing, or it can push us toward living out the ideas that we profess and keep us uncomfortable as we strive to be better. And this resolution will do that. In terms of the challenges, one of the challenges is that it's USA-centric wording. It does not have international wording in it, but it also could help challenge the apostles to develop an action plan to expand our awareness in region-specific ways to take action. It will be challenged and is challenging because it will come up against USA members and others who are unaware of their innate prejudice or who deny their participation in privilege and the institutionalized racism. And there's no way to convince people that we all are in that boat. The resolution challenges us to learn more, to not sit back and do nothing, which is being complicit and silent about racism. It challenges us because we often don't know enough to act. We can't take the initiative because we are shy. We don't have the kind of personality to take the lead. But it would also challenge us to network and connect with members who are already doing things. We want to interact with the champions for this cause, work with the interfaith groups that are already taking action. Not everyone has to go to protests. Not everyone has to take the initiative. Not everyone has to teach and lead, but everyone can do something, and we need to do what we can.
So I'm going to start with benefits that education, understanding frees us to speak out, stand with. That it gives voice to those who are experiencing prejudice and kind of puts us in a listening mode to those voices. Some challenges expressed that this is not a global resolution, that it is very focused on Western colonization, and wonder if it's better considered at national conferences. Or we talked about the possibility of trying to reword it to make it a global, something pertinent more globally. There was concern expressed about reverse discrimination and unwillingness of some immigrant populations to assimilate, and that there needs to be care in the focus.
We all kind of came to the importance of this issue for us in different ways, but kind of a commonality was through our work and through other life experiences that we've had. So the issue was important to everybody in the group, recognizing the need that we all have to continue to peel the layers of the onion was the metaphor that we use as we discover more and more ways that we learn more about how we come from our white privilege and how that impacts words that we say that we don't even know what we're saying that can be offensive, and learning about that and how important that is. The biggest impact that we talked about from the resolution is just that it was shine the light on the issue, and that it's such an important issue that does need to have that light shined on it, that it gets us into dialogue about the issue and talking and having some of those tough conversations. Challenges similar to what it sounds like many of the other groups have talked about, some struggles with the wording, a lot of things, again, everyone's already talked about, some of the defensiveness that the wording might create, and that the resolution as its whole might create, would definitely be shared as a challenge. just, I think the overarching thoughts from the group was just the continual need to shine the light on the issue and to take action on the issue, as well as dialogue, but to take action.
I'll just name the quickly pieces that we had in common. The point about coming from various life experiences and contacts with persons who have experienced or our own sheltered life, that this will be difficult for some Community of Christ members. It will encourage further conversations and will show that we are side by side with other churches and organizations addressing it. It is U.S.-centric. Some of the unique things that our group shared that haven't been mentioned yet, I don't think, is that if it's passed, then we have to walk the talk or it has no integrity. That one of the benefits is that anything we do to remedy social injustice issues is a positive, and racism would be included in that. One of the impacts is that we would be confessing our complicity in racism. So now we are putting it out there in print. It signals to those who have experienced racism that we're standing with them, and it emphasizes the worth of all persons. One of the concerns was that because not everyone may be supportive of the resolution, comments made by groups in groups such as this or at conference could be hurtful to those who have experienced racism and just deepen their hurt. Uncovering and addressing institutional racism is going to be very challenging. How is that done? What's the process for that? And the church taking a stance on something like this doesn't have much effect unless it has some policy to stand with it. When we view this issue through the lens that we come through, and that often can limit us from the broader picture that racism really incorporates. The whereases in the resolution influence how we view the resolution. Although those are not voted on, recognize it has an impact. And there is a comment there about government institutions, and that puts the focus outside of ourselves rather than focusing on who we are within the institution. And recognizing that we are homogeneous here and that our conversations and in many of our congregations are with like people. So the challenge is, how do we incorporate diverse groups in order to have that deeper conversation, which is also a challenging one. And continuing to examine our own lives is a way of being and is needed as we think about how we encounter or actually live out racism in our own lives.
So first and foremost, we came to the agreement that we wanted to applaud the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center for bringing this resolution forward, because it does remind us that we should not continue in a place of complacency. That racism did not end with the Martin Luther King era, that it continues on. And we all have witnessed the events of the last couple of years, and this is just kind of acknowledging that. And so we applaud those efforts. However, we did agree that the resolution needs a little more clarity, maybe some more concrete actions. Where do we go from here? We acknowledged that we do come from a pretty homogeneous world in our church. And so we need to look for ways outside of our congregations and our mission centers, and to be able to come up with practical ways to walk in the shoes of others who have experienced racism. We would like to see maybe one more whereas or resolved in this resolution to give some maybe concrete guidance to where do we go from here, to include intentional sharing by in congregations and in communities and in mission centers, And even at World Conference, we wanted to make sure that that it's acknowledged that, you know, we are very inclusive of people from all over the world, but we want to make sure that those efforts are continued and that delegates from all over the world at World Conference are heard, and that we have opportunity to raise the awareness and discuss these issues at World Conference.
The life experiences that have informed our decision included loving all people, living from a standpoint grounded in love for all people that informed our life decisions. Growing up in the church and learning how God loves everyone, and growing up in a multi-ethnic community. The history of settling our country and the persecution of the indigenous, experience with people, individual people of color, and seeing the discrimination of our friends of color. Growing up in the church and not seeing ethnicities. So one possible impact is there could alienate some members. However, it is in line with other changes, for instance, women in the priesthood, inclusion of LGBTQ people. One benefit is the awareness and increasing awareness and education and exploring more inclusiveness and welcoming. The need, this came up again and again, the need to individually and personally live it out. A benefit is expanding the reality of the worth of all persons, aligning our principles. It is a next step toward kingdom living. An impact could possibly be in other countries that have majority ethnicities. How would that affect them? And nobody's had any thoughts on that because none of us are in that situation. Our experience in these groups is that many of us want to and do live from a standpoint of love for everyone. Challenging may be the discussion at conference, and we hope that it will not be divisive or politicized. Challenging is on, again, the personal level, living it out, living with an open mind and an open heart, and truly seeing the other. An insight, the more we live it, the easier it becomes.
In terms of the life experiences, we duplicated what the first group indicated. That is, when you get to know a person individually, it's much more easy to have receptivity rather than racism. One member had a caregiver who was Black and observed that other people had refused this person's services because they were Black. But she said she just loved her, and she told the company, I hope she's my caregiver for the rest of my time together. Some of our members had no problem with racism at all growing up. As opposed to me being from deep South, I had all kinds of experiences with racism. Fortunately, but since I've been a member of the church since I was 9 years old, I've worked most of my life to overcome racism. And it's not easy. When a person lives and experiences opportunities to make himself better than another person, it's not easy to overcome. And to show that racism can be much more than just Black versus white, one of our members' mother had an ancestor who was from Germany, but the name was not indicative that that was the origin. And she was extremely pleased with that because in World War II, as we all probably know, Germans were not well received at all by the rest of the world. So racism can be a problem no matter the race. We experience some of that with our border situation nowadays. Life experiences are quite important. The benefit of this particular resolution, in our group, we had some question as to whether it's really necessary. The enduring principles, we think, line out the intent of this resolution. We found that the resolution was quite convoluted. The preamble to the resolution part of the resolution was opportunity to have all kinds of thoughts come into your mind. And unfortunately, and this maybe have the intent of the resolution, racial justice has become quite politicized. And politicians tend to emphasize the wrong points usually. So we have the opportunity as community of Christ to live in such a way we can set a different example than people are used to seeing. And this is the challenge that we found, becoming real Christians. That is, living in such a way that we are able to implement what we say we believe. In other words, it's hard to live what you believe with other forces impinging from all sides.
I've listened to the summaries that have been previously stated, and many of the things are universal throughout this group. We did, as we began, we saw that the benefits of the resolution would indeed promote worth of all persons, and that was one of the enduring principles, was to make sure. We also saw that this would help to bring about reconciliation. Whenever we think of the principles of Christ, one of the main things was reconciliation between all. We also saw that this would help the church move forward into a kingdom of shalom, perfect peace, of wholeness within the body itself and possibly even within our own lives. So one of the things, though, that we did see about impact was the fact that it could possibly affect those who live in areas or even experiences right now of racism. And the possibilities are multitude whenever you think about that. Some of the challenges and the insights that we got from our meeting together was the fact that quite a few of us were concerned with the wording of the resolution. It seemed to place much more of an emphasis upon American culture versus global culture. And for some of our experiences, those of us who were history buffs recognized that racism began much sooner than 400 years ago, and it is also a global problem, not just an American problem or centered on an American problem. It is a problem for all races. We also thought that this could divide within the church because, again, so many have been raised in an atmosphere that does not seem racial to them, but more something learned. And we agreed that racism was something that was learned rather than inherent within us. We were concerned that some might leave if this resolution is worded the way it is. We also thought that some of the steps towards the end of how we should solve this were extremely vague, and that many people would be unsure about how to proceed forward in bringing a solution to racism. So we felt like that possibly this resolution might need some amending and or adding to, at least in two different areas. One, in the fact that it should be a global, and maybe giving us a little bit more concrete parameters as to how we can live this out. We were very willing to admit that many of us have prejudices, maybe not so much in racism, but in prejudices that affect our entire lives, and that this resolution is simply a beginning of many of the things that need to be changed. So I think the last thing that we wanted to say that kind of reinforces this is the fact that most of these are in English, and that many of us in our group felt like we really did not have a diverse enough representation to understand racism and to the fact that if it's only being in English within this group, are we really reaching our entire, I don't want to say congregation, or the people that we should really be addressing? So those were some of the ideas and some of the insights that we gained from one another, and the fact that this resolution may need to be adjusted a little bit before it can be brought to a world or a global group that is more accepting.
Multiple folks referenced childhood experiences, some of them wherein they were exposed to explicit and certainly implicit examples of racism and racial injustice. In one instance, a person grew up in a community where racial epithets were used openly in the middle of the 20th century. But having been a member of this church since childhood, learning about fairness and equity toward all people as, call it restoration values, there was an understanding that the way things were at the time wasn't really aligned with the church's outlook on racial justice and the worth of all persons. Multiple members of the group expressed appreciation for the resolution and awareness that there is evidence of white supremacy in the United States, and were supportive of this resolution as part of a response that the church needs to make in support of the dignity of everyone, of all persons. One of our participants has a background in social work, has done advanced work in social work, and that education and work experience enabled them to see how racial injustice is impactful and is at the root of so many of the ways that people are treated in this country, but that the enduring principles call all of us to a different way of living, and that the worth of all persons is central to that outlook and to Christ-like living. And I think just broadly that sense that this resolution further communicates and adds light to our principles and is a pretty crucial step in the church's journey. A person indicated, I want to say that I am not racist, but I need to be actively involved in not being racist through my church, through my community. This resolution supports me in that way, confirms for me that I am involved in that work. And I am repenting for my sins, for the sins of our nation and communities. And I thought very succinctly said, if we are a church that pursues peace, how can we not make a statement about erasing racism? It's important to put some teeth into our enduring principles regarding the worth of all and the importance of diversity. In our worship with others, we can explicitly represent that we are supportive of other persons of different backgrounds and races, and that we are endeavoring to understand their experience. This could help us express that we are unbiased, that we are working to be unbigoted, and may open us for ministry to other persons of other backgrounds, which might be a driver of growth in our communities and our congregations. Naming racism as sin will cause some difficulty for some. I think it's important that we work through that and commit to it. A challenge for us is how much we have to learn about other cultures, what their experience is, where they're coming from. I can be friendly, I can be nice, but I don't think that alone is enough. So there is a hunger, I think, to understand what more can I do, what more am I called to do? And that a realization that we are being called to new approaches to ministry, that they are needed and that they are appropriate in this awareness that we would be sort of codifying in this resolution. What can we learn from other faith traditions that have embraced social justice as core to their identity? And how can we express ourselves in new ways that today, that now feel strange or uncomfortable to us?
Part of our concern was there was not a lot of detailed, specific actions, resulting from the resolution. Will there be a committee? Will there be a way to pass information on to the mission centers or the congregations to try to do some sort of education? We'd like to see a list of resources. One of our members talked about the diversity workshop that she attended through the World Church a couple of years ago, but does not see that offered at this point. So it might serve the World Church well to get that workshop going again. We also noted that this was not available in Spanish, and probably many of our people on the other side of the border would be interested or have definitely different information, different impact to share with us. I know that's hard to get the Spanish or French going, but anyway, we also thought it really is a personal issue as well. We really need to start this within ourselves and recognize our own privileged positions. Our church is full of white privilege, and we need to admit that and be willing to see where we need to change, and also be willing to confront racism or any type of injustice where we see it, whether it's in our families or coworkers or neighbors or even in the stores where we go. So we did get a list of some books that some of our members in our room had read and said that they're very helpful. So those types of resources would be good for the World Church to share, not just having a resolution that ends up in a book someplace.
One of the things that came up was, and this came up several times in our conversation, was about the harshness of the language, that it seems to be written more for the people of one area of the world, and that really we need to make it so that it can help people worldwide. If some of the things were put into practices in some places in the world, it was brought up that there would be some people that would be in danger with the practices that would be put in place. So we have to become more knowledgeable about that and how we can present things and what needs to be done for everybody's safety. It was also brought up that this is written as racial injustice, and that maybe it would be more far-reaching if it were racial/ethnic injustices, because there are even injustices within races that need to be addressed. It was also mentioned that legislating something doesn't necessarily make it more effective, that we need to find ways to continue to reach out to people of all races and ethnicities, and to share our apologies and help them. One person said that they would have liked to have seen the wording directed more at revelation that we've been given, so that with the words like members need to be in the forefront of justice and peace, and use some of those ways that we have been guided through revelation to share. Others felt that it had been many restrictions in this, and that it needs to be broader to make it applicable to all people. It was also brought up that we feel it would be better to use positive wording. And many times it came up that the second resolve was really well liked in our group, that seemed to have a lot of worth to it.
Some of the things that we mentioned have already been addressed. I won't spend a lot of time with that. The definition of racism seems to be very inadequate and incomplete, and for some of the same reasons that have already been stated. And the last resolution doesn't really lead us anywhere to accomplishing anything specific, no conclusion to it, and that one needed some work. And the first resolution seemed to be taking a great deal away in terms of agency and almost to a declaration of a statement of faith. And that would really fly in the face of trying to be a more welcoming congregation to all people, because we will have people coming in with all kinds of issues. The racial bias is going to be one of those. But our task is to show them a better way. The enduring principle that we already have, the worth of all persons, was emphasized, and it already states a great deal. If we really look at it, maybe we need to do more with regard to that. Yeah, the enduring principle is already making a statement about it, and this resolution seemed to be more confusing than accomplishing anything specific.
We recognize that there's 40,000 and not just 400 years of racism with the extinction of the Neanderthals. We also recognize that the emphasis on interracial versus intraracial is significant, but there is really only one race, and that is the human one. That we can become a more inclusive church is a comfortable idea, but not such a comfortable actual thing to approach. There are 3 of the 43 faces that we saw on the gallery this evening or this afternoon that were people of color, and that speaks of our need to be more inclusive. We have a racism construct which helps us to marginalize people, and so the whole idea of being able to marginalize others is completely in contrast to our need to be inclusive. And so as we look at that, we have lots of our personal experiences to bring into it. But one emphasis is that our institutionalized racism remains one of those subtle things. Even though we've made significant improvement in the church in the upper quorums, we in our congregations still tend to be rather segregated and isolated, and therefore not growing. And one of the possibilities is that we need to use Zoom more to give ourselves more outreach and contact to do a better job of integrating. The fact that that beyond the United States, we are still need to be sensitive, and the focus here is on the American vantage point, yet marginalization occurs in virtually every culture. And so for everyone born to have a place at the table, provide a microphone that everyone can use, and to be able to reason together in love so that we can allow the truths to come from that the scriptures promise is important to us. Generally, our group is in strong support of the resolution, particularly in keeping it rather general in the later resolves, because we are responsible to reason together in love and truth, and in choosing to respect, that is to look again and again with equity in mind as we look at those people that are marginalized and embrace them.
Most of us came from a dominantly white community, and most of us became aware of inequality through life after we grew up. We also discussed some books that we read that we thought were very good resources for that. We were very concerned being an all-white group trying to discuss this issue. We'd like to have had more diverse voices be in the conversation. We felt it was a benefit to the community of Christ having this resolution, since it brings forth the horrors of our past and our present. The resolution needs to be less American in its language. For example, African American is obviously very American in speaking, so is Latinos. We had to ask ourselves, how would a more diverse group write this resolution than having the Americanisms of it as it's currently presented? We also had a concern is how to implement the resolves as the resolution is currently written. It's very broad in scope, but it does not provide for a concrete action.
We did find among ourselves that we had fairly limited exposure to racial issues through our lives, and yet in the midst of our conversation, we found ourselves using racial terminology that probably was not appropriate. And so beginning to recognize that as an important piece of the journey. We did recognize that there is a diversity and inclusion team at the world church level and even in some mission centers, and that we need to recognize their effort here as well, not ignore that. We do believe that this resolution helps jog the church and remind us of the issues that are called out here, and that it could help or divide the church, depending on how some of the wording is interpreted, because of the generic nature of many of the terms. And so, again, some cleanup, as has been mentioned. There was some discomfort, I guess, with whether the resolution is requesting us to take action or requiring us to take action. But we recognize that there are victims of racism on both sides of a discrimination issue, those who are discriminating and those who are being discriminated against and kind of pushing back. And so we had some experiences that were shared in our group about that. But we do need to be aware of our attitudes, our behaviors, and specifically our words that we use, even if they're words that we grew up with, to make sure that we are not continuing on the journey of being racist and insensitive. We want to look beyond this racism as a sin, because there are a number of sins, and we want to be open to Jesus' direction that calls us beyond all of them, even though racism is a place that we fall down as a human race. We're wondering what triggered this resolution to be brought forward by those that are submitting it, and also had a desire that if we can do this right, maybe we can get in our grandchildren's generation, get rid of the word racism and discrimination and prejudice and those kinds of concepts. So part of the journey towards Zion.
We came into this discussion from a variety of life experiences that brought perspective, from having experienced direct racism individually to not having really even seen it in our community growing up. But all of us agreed that over the last several years, through media attention and just raising awareness on a variety of different formats, we've all become more aware of racism as an overt measure, but also as just the systemic racism that historically has existed. In terms of benefits and impacts, we all brought up the importance of the conversation itself and simply raising awareness that racism exists, whether we see it overtly, whether we have experienced it or not, it exists, and there is a need to understand it and understand our part in it and the historical aspects of it. We identified that it can be an entry point of conversation for seekers. We can also use it as an opening for difficult conversations within our congregations and in the broader community. The point was made that often having uncomfortable or being uncomfortable with a topic often is what moves us forward in resolving that issue. So it's important to be having the conversation at all. And that is one of the definite benefits of this resolution. In terms of challenges, however, one of the challenges has been mentioned is how do we make this not a U.S. centered resolution, but a global one, because racism exists all over the world and not just in the United States. So I think that's been mentioned by some other groups, that there's a bit of a US focus on this, and we can certainly move it out to a more global context. And then the question of what do we do now? What are the practical outcomes that would result from passage of this? Because there's nothing really identified. And I think we need to, not only with this resolution, but look at all the resolutions that have been passed, over many years of world conferences. What happens after it passes? How do we communicate that to not only our congregations and our community, but beyond that? And so the challenge is, how do we make it known to others that we have embraced this concept of racial justice? And then the challenge of admitting, as per resolution the first resolved, how do we wrestle with admitting our own sin and our complicity, unknowingly or not, in racism, and acknowledge that. And that goes back to that difficult conversation. How do we understand what parts we have individually played in racism, and wrestling with that? And above all else, I think we all sensed hope that in recognizing racism exists and in bringing it forward to open up these conversations, there's hope for the future, that racism is something we can discuss openly, as difficult as it might be. And so there's definitely hope in that.